A woman was found dead inside her home in what initially appeared to be a violent attack. Someone close to her quickly became the focus of the investigation. A key witness stepped forward and provided a detailed account of what had happened. Her version of events helped shape the direction of the case. At the time, it seemed consistent and credible. But not everything in her account could be confirmed. Some details did not fully match what investigators found. Years later, a separate incident brought her back into the center of another investigation. This time, the story she told began to collapse under closer scrutiny. What once supported the case would later become the reason it was questioned. In 2011, Betsy Faria was found dead inside her home in Missouri after a violent attack involving multiple stab wounds. The condition of the scene suggested a sudden and intense incident inside the residence. Her husband, Russ Faria, reported discovering her body later that evening and contacted emergency services. From the beginning, investigators focused on reconstructing the timeline of Betsy's final hours. Pamela Hupp, a close friend of Betsy, became a key witness because she had been with her earlier that day. Pamela told investigators that she had picked Betsy up, spent time with her running errands, and later dropped her back at her home. According to Pamela, Betsy was alive, coherent, and alone when she left at the house. She also stated that nothing appeared unusual and that Betsy was expecting to spend the evening at home. This account helped establish a timeline that placed Betsy at home shortly before her death. Investigators relied heavily on Pamela's version to determine Betsy's last known movements and condition. However, key parts of this timeline depended entirely on Pamela's statements, including the exact time she dropped Betsy off and the period immediately after. There was no independent confirmation, such as verified timestamps or witnesses, to fully support those specific details. Following the discovery of Betsy Faria's body, investigators began analyzing the timeline based on the information available to them. Pamela Hupp's account became central to that process, as she was the last known person to see Betsy alive. According to her statement, Betsy had been dropped off at home and was expected to remain there for the evening. This timeline placed Betsy inside the house during the period when the attack was believed to have occurred. Attention quickly shifted toward Russ Faria, who reported finding her later that night. Investigators examined his movements, communication records, and activities during that time frame. His alibi included being away from the home for several hours, which became a key point of scrutiny. At the same time, Pamela's timeline was largely accepted as the foundation for establishing Betsy's final movements. There were limited independent checks to confirm the exact drop-off time or what occurred immediately afterward. Investigators did not have additional witnesses or verified timestamps to challenge that portion of the timeline. As a result, her account was not strongly disputed during the early stages of the investigation. This allowed the case to move forward based on a single, unverified narrative. As the investigation continued, additional aspects of Betsy Faria's life began to receive closer attention. One of those areas involved her financial arrangements, including a life insurance policy. The policy was valued at a significant amount and had been updated shortly before her death. Initially, it was believed that the beneficiary was a family member. However, it was later confirmed that Pamela Hupp had been named as the primary beneficiary. This introduced a financial connection between Pamela and the outcome of the case. At the same time, questions began to arise about how consistently Pamela's account aligned with other known details. While her overall timeline had been accepted early on, some elements lacked supporting evidence. There were no independent confirmations of the exact sequence of events after she dropped Betsy off. Her involvement was still viewed primarily as a witness, but her position within the case had become more significant. These factors did not immediately change the direction of the investigation, but they began to introduce doubt about whether the timeline was as complete as it first appeared. As the investigation continued, additional aspects of Betsy Faria's life began to receive closer attention. One of those areas involved her financial arrangements, including a life insurance policy. The policy was valued at a significant amount and had been active prior to her death. However, investigators later confirmed that the beneficiary designation had been changed in the period leading up to the incident. Instead of a family member, Pamela Hupp had been named as the primary beneficiary. This change introduced a direct financial connection between Pamela and the outcome of the case. At the time, the significance of that change was not fully explored in the early stages of the investigation. Attention remained focused on the timeline that had already been established. At the same time, questions began to arise about how consistently Pamela's account aligned with other known details. While her overall timeline had been accepted early on, some elements lacked supporting evidence. There were no independent confirmations of the exact sequence of events after she dropped Betsy off. These factors began to introduce doubt about whether the timeline was as complete as it first appeared. Years after the initial investigation, a separate incident brought Pamela Hupp back into the center of attention. In this case, she reported that a man had approached her and forced his way into her home. According to her account, the individual intended to carry out an attack and make it appear connected to the earlier murder. She stated that she was able to defend herself during the encounter and that the situation escalated quickly. The incident was initially presented as a sudden and violent intrusion by an unknown attacker. However, as investigators examined the scene, several elements of her account began to raise specific questions. There were limited signs of a forced or chaotic entry that would typically accompany a violent home invasion. The sequence of movements she described inside the home did not fully match the physical layout and condition of the scene. Some aspects of the encounter relied entirely on her explanation, without independent evidence to support them. Investigators also noted that the situation appeared more contained and controlled than would be expected in an unpredictable attack. As these details were reviewed together, similarities to the earlier case became more apparent. This incident shifted the focus of the investigation back toward Pamela herself. As investigators re-examined both incidents together, a consistent pattern began to emerge. The second incident was no longer viewed as an isolated home invasion, but as a constructed event that redirected attention. The individual involved in that encounter was later identified, and the circumstances surrounding the event did not support the narrative of a random attacker. Instead, the situation appeared to have been arranged in a way that relied heavily on Pamela's account to define what had happened. This raised questions about whether the earlier case had followed a similar structure. When investigators looked back at Betsy Faria's death, they began reassessing the timeline that had originally guided the investigation. Pamela's position as the last person to see Betsy alive, combined with the unverified nature of her timeline, became increasingly significant. The financial connection, including the life insurance policy that named Pamela as the beneficiary, added a clear motive that had not been fully addressed earlier. The lack of independent confirmation for key parts of both timelines became a central issue. In both cases, the sequence of events depended largely on a single narrative that had not been thoroughly challenged at the time. As these elements were analyzed together, the earlier conclusion of the investigation began to shift. The case was no longer centered on Russ Faria, but on the role Pamela Hupp may have played in shaping both incidents. What had once been treated as separate events were now understood as connected through a repeated pattern of control and narrative construction. As the investigation progressed, the conclusions of the earlier case were formally challenged and re-examined. The conviction of Russ Faria was overturned after the evidence and timeline were reassessed in detail. Attention shifted fully toward Pamela Hupp as inconsistencies in her statements and actions became central to the case. Further investigation established that she had benefited from a life insurance policy valued at approximately $150,000. The beneficiary change made in the period before Betsy's death became a key factor in establishing motive. In addition to the earlier case, the second incident involving the staged home intrusion led to separate criminal charges. In that case, Pamela Hupp later entered a guilty plea, admitting that the event had been deliberately arranged. This admission confirmed that the second incident had been constructed to support a false narrative. As the pattern became clear, investigators concluded that the earlier murder had also been shaped by the same control of events and information. While she did not publicly provide a detailed narrative confession of the first crime, the evidence and circumstances led to formal charges in connection with Betsy Faria's death. The combined weight of financial motive, timeline control, and repeated narrative construction formed the basis of the case against her. She ultimately received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. What began as a trusted witness account ended as a confirmed pattern of deception, control, and lethal intent.